That was a good break, wasn't it? Okay, so we've been talking about epiphanies, and I'm kind of curious to hear about things that you all have encountered in your own life. It obviously does not have to be like a theological thing. It could be anything. I'm going to share a little one for me. So I'll kind of start off with a bit of a controversial statement, which is to say, it's especially controversial in this church. I don't understand the reality of being non-binary or transgender. I don't personally understand it. There's probably many reasons for that. I'm not myself non-binary or trans. Maybe I'm too limited in my scope. Maybe I, too, am deeply trapped in the gender binary that we're all handed all the time, totally compliant with cultural expectations of my own biological and social definition. But the epiphany is, I don't have to understand something in order to be compassionate or respectful or even supportive, even an advocate. So consider for a moment the story of Jesus in Mark's Gospel encountering a woman from Syrian Phoenicia asking for healing for her daughter. You may know this story. Syria is not the same as we think of. Syria then was a Roman province that included parts of our present-day Syria, but also parts of Lebanon and Turkey and even Israel, modern-day Israel. And Phoenicians were an ancient Semitic people, probably related to the biblical Canaanites, all part of tribes that lived in that area. So this is a Phoenician woman living in that Syrian province. Both geographically and ethnically, the Syro-Phoenician woman represents somebody who's really on the borders to Jesus' people. She's a Gentile, she's a woman, she's a foreigner, like triply marginalized in his culture. At the very height of what his culture would call unclean. And in fact, he treats her like this at first, responding to her cry for help with, the children have to be fed first. It isn't right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Right? It's a really dismissive, kind of curt, insulting kind of thing to say. And then, as many of you know, she pushes back a little, saying, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he praises her for this and offers the healing. And the question is, was this all a setup by Jesus, like a show for his onlooking disciples? Or is Jesus actually being shamed into doing this? And I have what I think is a more provocative question about that story. What if Jesus realizes all of a sudden in that moment, he has this epiphany, that he doesn't have to identify with this woman who is so different than him in order to help her? What if her simple and direct response is a reminder to him of the very things that he has said? God loves everyone, and so therefore God loves her too. What if this is not so much shame as it is an act of integrity on his part? We all need to have a good ethical system, and that system can't be very good if there's no accountability, right? So maybe this little story from Mark is that even someone like Jesus needs the chance to look in the mirror. It's hard to have an ethic because despite how much you may want to believe in love your neighbor as yourself, as your ethic, you come across a neighbor that you really don't want to love, right? And you need that mirror to go, well, here's what you've said, so how are you going to live that out? I can't understand everything. I don't understand algebra. I don't understand quantum physics. I don't understand how to do brain surgery. I don't understand why we drive on a parkway but park on a driveway. But I don't have to be able to understand everything. That's my epiphany. And if somebody tells me who they are, I should believe them. That works all kinds of ways, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So the epiphany for me has been that understanding is not a prerequisite for care, respect, or acceptance. And in fact, I would even argue that it's sometimes hard to get to understanding if you don't offer the care, the respect, and the acceptance, which kind of leads that direction. So that's been an epiphany for me, and I think it's a pretty countercultural one in a world in which love is so always, almost always conditional. Right? You can have love if this, if that, if the other, which is with all kind of language around understanding. Like, you need to fit into my mold in order for me to offer you love. Right? So there's like an example. I mean, I said it doesn't have to be like theological or biblical, and then I used a Bible story in the middle of it. But I am a pastor, after all. So it is my frame of reference. Yeah. When I think of something, I go to Bible stories. Justin goes to Bart, and we all do whatever. Karl Barth, yeah. Theology. Or Tolkien. He's a nerd. So we've had a couple classes now. What are some epiphanies that you all have kind of recognized in your own life?
I know I talk a lot, but this is actually appropriate to the first thing you mentioned. And I know Sally has heard this before. But the epiphany about my identity. For, a lot of years, a few years, I thought I might have been gay. And then I figured out pretty quick that wasn't it. Mm-hmm. And about a little over 20 years ago, when I was still at home, I saw a documentary on HBO about a trans man who was dying from ovarian cancer because no doctor would treat him. And his little group of people, the allies and other trans people. And after watching it, I didn't understand why completely, but I felt a kinship. And I thought it was just like, outcasts kind of, grouping together. A couple of years later, it's like the universe just started planting things. I've read a memoir from a woman who was married and transitioned, and how her marriage adjusted and all of that with it. Not long after, then I saw a movie about Christine Jorgensen, who was the first big American celebrity way back in the 50s. Yeah. And I thought, this interesting timing. But anyway, but time went on, and I came out one time, thought that might have been back anyway. Then later on, one day, I watched a movie about a trans woman who finds out that she has a son from a previous relationship and has to take him across country from wherever to California. And I'm watching this movie, and all of a sudden out of the blue went, whoa, that's it. That's the answer. That's what's going on.
Was it like a light bulb?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just all those little pieces, and they just finally all came together.
It took more than one of them, apparently. I
Yeah.
mean, you'd heard a version of that story more than once.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe it took you being in a different place in your own life, for sure.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. That's good. So I think we don't often think about that aspect of people who are, especially understanding their own sexuality or gender identification outside of the scope of the normal, the stereotypically normal kind of framework. So a non-binary definition or a trans definition or a gay, lesbian, any of those kind of something that is inherently what we say queer now, so outside of the typical, and something we don't think about too much, especially when I'm saying we in that as people who are trying to be allies or trying to identify with that. And that can be lots of people, by the way. So just because you are lesbian or gay does not mean you have any sort of understanding about what trans life is like, or even an identification with that, or any of that. So we can't assume any of those things. But the aspect is, how do you discover this? And that could be a window where somebody who was different in their sexual identity could maybe understand a different gender identity, because they at some point theoretically had their own epiphany moment of, oh, this is how I'm different. And they could at least understand that portion of how that sort of change comes to, even if they don't understand how is it that you see yourself as a different gender than you are, to put that in that what's often the first phase of that kind of level of understanding. So it's important to help hear other people's stories that help you, and hear those things in a non-judgmental way that helps you accept or appreciate how somebody is themselves wrestling with. They didn't just wake up one day and all of these pieces fit together. In fact, quite often are still trying to piece all of that. That's like an ongoing process of trying to figure out where they are in the world and how they fit in the world. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else? Yeah?
Well, attending the Remind and Renew at Phillips the last few days, several epiphanies came up, but when
You guys talk amongst yourselves here.
Rita Brock and Susan Diamond talked about moral injury, it suddenly hit me why I am so afraid of showing who I am until I feel really, really safe. Because back in the dark ages, when I was in high school, in a small town, one of 3 high schools in the county, with kids I had gone to school with since 3rd grade, I found out there was a religious ceremony held on the school grounds prior to graduation. Now, that was not separation of church and state, and I decided to open my big mouth. And I wrote a letter to the school editor. I was called into the vice principal's office. He said, "We will not publish this." And he said, I said, "But it's against church and state separation." He said, "You may believe that, but you don't have to come." I said, "Well, it's assumed that everybody who's graduating is going to come." He said, "They don't have to. You don't have to go." So I said, "I won't." So I started a petition because I'm not about to get silenced. And I started circulating it. I was called rabble-rouser. I was called troublemaker. I had a friend that I had been close to for several years turn her back on me, say, "You are not my friend." I had one friend who said, "I do not agree with you, but you are still my friend." It was, and because of that, I'm afraid to let all of me out until I feel really, really safe. As a community organizer, I know I didn't build my base before I went public, but my big mouth has gotten me in trouble several times for this, for unpopular views. But moral injury, and that's why here it is. It still is evident.
How many people signed that petition?
No one.
No one, you.
Yeah, one signed the petition.
Well, this epiphany is not really real dramatic or anything, but it's important to me. So for most of my married life, I have helped my husband with pottery. And it was just like, oh, on my to-do list. Okay, you do the dishes, you go make a few pots, and then you go home and fix dinner, whatever. So I was just kind of, feeling that way. And then whenever I participated in the St. Ignatius spiritual exercises, and we talked about how anything that you do can be a spiritual exercise, can be a spiritual practice. You just have to reframe it to be intentional, mindful, grateful. Notice how what you're doing is helping other people. So I started looking at my tasks at the studio differently. And it was just like an epiphany to me after all these years that, oh, I'm doing what God wants. I'm doing God's will. Even if it wasn't what I was called to do. Like, oh, you're called to teach or you're called to be a nurse or whatever. It was still important to me to approach it that way. Pardon?
She said you're being called to teach, ignore it.
Michelle, that's this. It's reframing.
Hang on.
Reframing your thought processes. When I first picked up crochet over the summer, I was like, oh, I just need something to do with my hands because we're going to be in the car for 86 hours. And then in talking to my therapist, he was like, that's meditation. And I was like, shut up. I have ADHD. I hate meditating. That's stupid. And then he was like, okay, but what are you thinking about when you're stitching? And I was like, well, mostly I'm trying to remember what number I'm on, which is why I've already counted this row like 7 times. But he was like, but no, really, what's going through your brain? And like, this is a baby blanket. And as I've been stitching it, I've just been like saying in my head, like, healthy baby, healthy family, healthy delivery, safe delivery. And so I'm kind of like weaving those prayers into every one of those stitches. So if you get something stitched from me, it is, but it's reframing that. And so I've kind of taken that into consideration anytime I'm creating or making, is that what am I stitching or weaving into what I'm making? And I gotta tell you, like, the release from like having that mentality, the creativity has gone through the roof, like to the point where I let Justin launch my little online shop. So it's cute. It's a cute little shop.
Corinthia told me I had to talk, so I'm just kidding. My recent epiphany that I'm still epiphysizing, I don't know, that I'm still
Epiphysizing.
epiphysizing.
Ooh, I like that.
Is how important rest is. How important rest is, and to give myself permission to rest and be okay. Because she knows I'm always like, there's things to do. There's always dishes to wash, laundry to fold. There's a book to read.
Always something to do.
Like, there's always something to do. And I struggle with not feeling guilty doing nothing. So I am working on that epiphany that it is okay to rest and just be, and that is the accomplishment. Because I'm like, we've got to accomplish something. We have things to do, and I always tell her I can rest when I die, but if I don't rest, I'm gonna die sooner. So.
Yeah.
You
Let's see, potato. Yeah.
So that is my epiphany that I'm working on, because for me it's a journey.
Yeah.
That it is okay to rest. So my accountability partner has to frequently remind me, if you want to go to bed at 7 at night, that is okay. Don't apologize. So.
It's so often our epiphanies are not just a single, like light switch kind of thing. We always characterize it as this, but so at least for me, it's an awareness that's new to me that I then have to figure out, well, like, how do I incorporate this in my life? Or if I really am going to do this, it's going to change so many things that it takes a long, long time. You know, the journey of that takes a long, or you're kind of living into it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I have an epiphany to share about epiphanies.
Oh, okay. Ooh.
Okay.
Ooh, this is like,
Yeah.
it's a double epiphany.
I'm
Yeah.
like, been trying to hold my tongue because I live on epiphanies. Like, I'm like looking for them all the
Yeah.
time. So one of the times that I was like theorizing about how do epiphanies happen, how do we like learn, does awareness happen? One of the things that I learned was that I can spend a lot of time thinking about stuff. Like, for instance, I have a coming out story that I, for well into my 40s, I thought I was heterosexual, aka shoved myself into the heterosexual box. So for over 40 years, well, over 25 years, it had been rolling through my head. The thought processes were going through my brain about my identity and sexuality and all of that stuff. And it wasn't until it like, okay, in the recovery world, we talk about the longest distance is the distance from your brain to your heart. Once it gets down to like a feeling, that's when the light bulb goes off. Once it goes from just theorizing and all of that stuff. So in my 40s, I went, oh crap, okay, time to quit analyzing this every 5 years. This is, I finally saw an identity that it was like, oh, there's a term for this. I get it now.
Yeah.
But it's that once I start having feelings about my thoughts, that's when light bulbs start going off.
Yeah. Danielle, that's a really interesting way to think about that, and I'm thinking about what you were talking about. Like, so you had these different stories all along the way, but it wasn't until it moved from here to here, like that the light bulb went off.
Yeah,
right?
once it starts becoming like a personal identification with the thought or the theory or the idea or the concept, then suddenly it becomes, okay, another one. As some people know, I'm considered a CODA, child of a deaf adult, but obviously my dad had plenty of hearing, well, through most of his 30s, past his 30s actually, but by the time he died, he was completely deaf. But I still sucked at learning sign language because I didn't have to with him. He still heard enough that we could communicate and all of this stuff. And it wasn't until I connected with an individual in the deaf community that it started to become personal enough. I started identifying with the experience enough that it became important to me. So,
Yep.
and then now I've become fairly fluent in ASL and trying desperately not to lose it. So, since Dad's been gone for 10 years.
Oh, I was just going to add on to what she said. A lot of times people don't, like something they hate or whatever, they don't realize that once they have somebody personal in their life,
Oh yeah.
like you said, it went
Yeah.
from here, like, that's wrong, that you're going to hell, blah, 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 until they meet somebody that they love, or like a grandchild, or their child, or even a very close friend comes out to them, and then they're like, oh, I guess they aren't bad people. You know what I mean? So
This is a very
like your
common.
epiphany.
Yeah, this is a very common thing within, like, unfortunately, in my experience, the single most transformational thing that can happen within a family that has very rigid ideas about, let's say, sexuality, is for a member of that family to come out. And there's many problems with that. Like, one, it puts all of the onus on that person to be courageous enough to do that. And two, that can be a transformational moment. It can also be a horribly destructive moment, because I've seen that go, both ways, depending on how that family wants to respond to that, which all comes back to sort of our notion of what we think this is, right? Now we're into, Joe would be so happy, now we're into sort of a theological map kind of thing, right? So if we have a healthy and good definition of this, then when that gets provoked in us, or we get confronted with that, or we have a Syrophoenician woman who says, well, how do you love, Jesus? Because that's really what she's saying. He has to go, oh, wait a second. I think of love as this inclusive, expansive thing. I'm going to have to adjust my actions here. Right? Thank you. Thank you. Your faith has, been a teaching moment here. But if your idea of love is warped in some way, broken in some way, if it is entirely conditional, right? If you have a model of God that is punitive and judgmental and angry, then you may react to this very differently. Your idea about what love is may be very different. And it becomes not a healing moment, but actually a damaging moment. So it's a real careful thing as a pastor to, at an affirming church, to understand that I really do think the single most transformational thing is the courage of someone to come out within their family or their community. I've seen that change things more than anything, because you will have, statistically speaking, the mother go, well, I have this cognitive dissonance because I know what the Bible tells me, but I know this, and I love my kid, and so now I'm going to have to wrestle with all the rest of this stuff, right? Yeah. Where's the mic? Oh, Becky's got one thing, and then we'll.
I tell my son this story, and he thinks it's coincidence, but he was 3 years old when it happened. I grew up Catholic, like Kathy, and she's talked about that a lot. So, God was the big guy up in the sky, taking account of how you were living.
Yeah. Keeping a ledger and
yes.
that. Yeah, right.
And I found myself married to Paul on the Oregon coast, where it is very cloudy and rainy, and I'm from New Orleans. I need my sunshine. I had 2 babies. He was traveling all the time, and we started going to the Presbyterian church, and that's where I learned that God loves me, and it was a good thing. And then it was 79 maybe, when everybody was lined up for gas, and Paul's job went kaput. And I mean, we had a house, we had 2 babies, and he just wasn't making any money. And I was really depressed. And I started praying. And all of a sudden, he found a job that was based in Baton Rouge, where my parents lived. And he had to leave town and go to all these different companies to learn what their products were. And he left me and said, sell the house, sell your car, get rid of everything we have, and my dad was in the furniture business, so we had a lot of stuff. And I said, God, if you're really there and you love me, please, I need help. And things started happening. And it was really weird. The house sold. My car, which was a big bunch of junk, sold. And everything that I had, that I loved, I got rid of. And it went to people who were so grateful and wanted it. And I'll just give you two examples. But one of them, this lady came to my house. She was like pregnant out to here with twins, and she needed a washer and dryer. And we made a deal that I could keep it until I moved, because I had diapers at my house too. There weren't any Pampers back then. And she got the washer and dryer. And they were all like that. But the one that really got me was I had a rocking chair. And it was a Thonay rocking chair. If you know what that was, those bent wood rocking chairs that had the cane seats. This was an original Thonay. It wasn't a knockoff. And it had perfect balance. My dad gave it to me when Matt was born. And I had in the paper, rocking chair for sale. And people kept calling, saying, is it an antique rocking chair? And I said, no, it's not an antique rocking chair. And this lady, the young girl, called and said, I'm calling about the rocking chair. And I said, well, it's not an antique. and she said, good, because I'm not looking for an antique. She said, describe it for me. So I told her what it was. And she just gasps. And she said, I want to come over and get the rocking chair. And so when she drove up, she got out of a van, and she had braces on her legs, and she had those things on her arm where were all connected to her arm. And so I took the rocking chair outside and put it on the sidewalk. And she sat down in it and started rocking. And she said, I have MS, and my doctor told me to find a rocking chair like this because that's how I can exercise my legs. And that's when I said, okay, God is here. He loves me. He's helping me.
Right.
And it happened again when we moved here. We moved here. I had been taking care of my mother, who had a stroke and could not stand up, for 7 years. And my son said, move to Tulsa. We'll be close by. You'll live in our house. He was moving to a bigger house. And we couldn't be in a more convenient area, close to doctors, grocery stores. We were living out in the country. And the only place I ever went was the neighborhood Walmart. And I kept driving by this sign. And it said, Church of Christ. And I said, Church of Christ. I haven't.
There are other words. Yes, that is part of it.
That scared me. And I said, Paul, when we are free and can go to church, I'm going to check that church out. And And my epiphany was that God is always there with me. I'm the one that's going in and out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Wow.
and I have to get down pretty low to,
Yeah. Yeah.
to go looking for him. But
That's
he's always there.
That's a powerful epiphany. Yeah. Yeah. And it's so I think, Kathy, did you have, so I think it's, this is an important sort of theological place to consider, because I am someone who does not ascribe theologically, like I would never write a paper endorsing or supporting the idea of a providential God, a God who pulls the strings and who is doing all of these things. And also, I can have moments like you're saying where I'm like, well, something seems to be orchestrating this. Like the flow of this is far too, like, exactly what I needed. I wasn't even asking for this. I was asking for something else. What I thought I needed was not what I really needed, and I got what I needed, actually. And sometimes you come to that realization sort of immediately, and sometimes you come to it afterwards. You can look back on things and go, that was really tough when I was going through that, but holy cow, like if that hadn't happened that way, I wouldn't be here, right? So there also seems to be this flow that I don't understand, and you don't have to understand it, and it doesn't have to work rationally. Like it's another big epiphany to think, I don't think God gives a hoot about our rationality. I don't think God cares about being logical or operating in a way that we can understand. I don't think that's how God works at all. And I've come to that realization after a long, long time of going, well, I didn't understand that at all, and here it is kind of working out. Yeah. Kathy?
Oh, that was a great story.
Yeah.
And I had one of those rockers too. So. Well, anyway, let's see. A few months ago, I think in October, my grandnephew died suddenly, unexpectedly. And he and his wife had two girls, one of them who had, within the past 2 years, gone trans. And she, I guess I should say they, were taking hormones and had moved out of the household. And so the mom was not accepting that decision. And the dad was with a band, and he was traveling quite a bit, but they were members of a pretty conservative church. So the trans relative told the mother, if you do not accept me, I am not coming to the funeral. And so I was kind of wondering how this was all going to work, and I didn't know this backstory before I got there, but Moby is the name, the new name, was part of the ceremony and talked and was going to perform or something and decided not to. But anyway, it was a gift to that family, and it had been something that, because of that death, turned into a gift.
It's another one of those things where, again, epiphanies don't come to us. Sometimes they're retroactive. Right? We don't realize, and it's only later looking back on something that makes you go, oh, well, that was that transformative moment. A funerals are real common. Funerals and weddings are real common. Pastors all know that there's a lot of drama, at those events for obvious reasons. And sometimes that drama can have real positive impact, and sometimes it can just be drama, right? And even kind of destructive drama. But the functionality of the family is revealed in those moments. Like, so if there's a tremendous amount of dysfunction, you can be sure that it's going to be dysfunctional in that high moment. And if there's some functionality, you can probably count on people leaning into that for the most part, and that being a helpful thing. And I've seen that be particularly transformative in the rejected member of the family, whoever that is, and for whatever reason, kind of returning to the fold in some way, and having that be an opportunity. So, other epiphanies?
Since we started by talking about Joe, I'll tell a quick story about my second class with Joe. I was transitioning from being a lawyer. I was still practicing law, and started driving my first semester to the campus that was then over on Tulsa, University of Tulsa's grounds. Had a little house over there. Mm-hmm. Very quaint, very nice. I used to love to go over there and spend money on the bookstore because they were all right there. You couldn't miss them. Anyway, so I don't know what the class was. I guess Theology 101, or, something like that. And so I'm there the first night. I'm going to get to the second night. And Joe was his typical, you've all seen him. He's effusive and happy and smiling and very all over the place. And so he finally gets down to business. He gets out the syllabus. He goes through it very, very dutifully, but you can tell he's in a big rush. And he finally gets through all of the necessary stuff, and he says, now we can finally talk about something important. Theology. And then he launches into this lecture. And every once in a while, he would look out at us, and it was a fairly full classroom. And he would look out at us and take time and look across, and he would go, And then he would go, well, and then he would launch back. And he did this about the third time. And his face was getting more and more perplexed and redder and redder. And it was obvious. I thought, well, maybe he has hives or something. And he, but he finally just explodes. And he said, how many of you have read Plato? And I had read quite a bit, but Plato wasn't exactly on my reading list. Yeah. And I said, I haven't. Plato? Why do I need to know anything about Plato? Mm-hmm. I mean, I was raised in the Baptist church. And boy, he said, oh my God. Oh my God. How many of you have never read anything of Plato? Well,
Yeah, most people. Right.
hands went up
Yeah.
all across the room, and he did a big spin in a circle, and I thought maybe he was just going to fall down right there, but he didn't. And he said, I just can't understand this. And then he says, wait, I know. You've all had an epiphany, and you've decided you're going to be ministers, and no one ever told you that it would be a whole lot simpler if you just started by reading Plato. And I said, yeah, that's about right. And of course, we were a class full of people, but there were a whole lot of shaking of heads going on. So anyway, that was the first class period. And so I drove all the way back to Oklahoma City and waited, I think it was a weekly class. So the class was 3 hours we went through this, and then came back the next week. And he waited and he waited and he stood there and he just, looked at everybody and he said, I don't suppose anyone's read Plato since last week.
Nope.
No. No. He said, well, I figured not. So we're going to have a crash course in Plato. And he launches in.
Oh, yeah.
He launches in. And he's going and going and going. And this is just horrible. I said, you can't take notes on this stuff. I mean, this isn't going to work at all. And I'm sitting there, my mind is going, this isn't what I thought I signed up for. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. Plato? That wasn't making any sense to me. And then on the way home that night, it's a long drive, especially on the turnpike in the dark, and I'm thinking about this. I'm going, no, wait a second. This guy, who's obviously, I guess once you get to know him, a decent fellow, he had something. This guy says that Plato is really sort of foundational if you really want a good launching point to understand our Christian faith. And I've been listening to sermons that say God hates who you are and what you're doing, and the only thing you need to do tonight is keep repenting over and over and over and over again, and we'll launch into the same sermon next week. Even though you heard it last week, we're not going to give you any credit for that. You're back in the fire and brimstone this next week. And he says that Plato is maybe a good place to start. And so for the first time in my life, I decided, you know what? I think I better start asking a whole lot of more questions. So I have Joe's rants to thank for that.
Joe's rants, yes.
Joe's rants.
Yeah. I'll have to tell Joe.
Well, he knows.
Your rants have been epiphanous to some people.
He knows
Yeah.
because I ranted right back.
Friends, thank you for sharing today. Next week we'll do one more kind of round of this. So if you have some stories that you'd still like to share, I think that's a good, important thing. I've got a sort of a wrap-up Epiphany thing, and then I want to give you sort of a heads up as what's coming, because Justin is going to teach in the month of February and is going to teach on the book of Revelation. It's such a pivotal time right now for us to think about. He's going to do some recapturing of that. If you've had some experience with that and it's probably been taught to you in a particular way, going to talk instead about the book of Revelation as pushing back as resistance in a time of political upheaval. Right. Is that a fair assessment, Justin? Revelation as resistance in a time of political upheaval. Okay. There's not for any poignant reason or anything. I mean, not for anything that's topical. We're just going to happen to do this in the month of February. All right, friends. See you over there.